Hey fellow backpackers, my name is Dan, and today I thought I would take a little stroll down memory lane to chat about my very first backpacking trip. So in this video, I'm going to start off with talking about some of the things that led up to my first backpacking trip, and then I will walk you through that first trip, and then I'm going to end on talking about a few of my valuable lessons learned from that trip. But to begin with, I need to share with you a super deep, dark secret. Actually, it's not so much of a secret at all because I've said this in many of my past videos, and that is the fact that I am not a lifelong backpacker. I actually didn't even enjoy hiking or the outdoors in general until, again, relatively recently. Now, my wife has always enjoyed hiking, and in the past, she would have to drag me kicking and screaming whenever she wanted to go on a hike in some local forest preserve trail. But all of that changed one random weekend when I had absolutely no plans and my wife was out of town, so I decided to take my dog hiking to Starved Rock State Park. Now, if you don't know anything about Starved Rock State Park, it is a very different type of topography than what you would typically find in Illinois. There are lots of canyons and hills and just not the usual flatness that you find throughout the rest of Illinois. And surprisingly, I had the time of my life, and I realized that there was something missing from all my other little hikes and random forest preserves, a sense of adventure. And to this day, that is still my number one thing that I love about backpacking, having a sense of adventure. So after that, I was absolutely hooked. I wanted to start going on day hikes every single weekend. And after a little while, I naturally just started to think about, I wonder if I would enjoy backpacking. I think that's a pretty typical progression for a lot of day hikers. So I started to spend the next 6 months doing a lot of research about what backpacking gear I would need and acquiring all that gear so I could go on my very first backpacking trip. Now, around that same time, another really big life-changing thing occurred. My wife and I decided to start a family. By the time my wife and I were ready for our first backpacking trip, she was about 6 months pregnant, which did present some challenges. Now, my in-laws live near the Smoky Mountains, which, if you don't know anything about the Smokies, it is a backpacker's paradise. And we do tend to go down there and visit them several times throughout the year, so we thought that the Smokies would be a perfect place for our first backpacking trip. So for our first trip, we decided to go down to the Lakeshore Trail, which is at the very southern part of the Smokies on the North Carolina side. And it begins at the very end of something called the Road to Nowhere. Now, the Road to Nowhere has a pretty cool history, but to make a long story short, it's essentially a road that the federal government was building through the Smokies in, I think, the 40s, I believe, but they eventually just never finished it. Hence the name, the Road to Nowhere. And the last thing that they did finish was a really cool tunnel that now acts as the very beginning to the Lakeshore Trail. So again, because my wife was 6 months pregnant, we decided not to push things mileage-wise. So we planned on going 3.5 miles to campsite 74. So we got to the trailhead, and I put on my backpacking pack with all my gear inside for the very first time, and I realized, oh dear God, this is so incredibly heavy. So I was actually quite happy that we were only going 3 miles that day. However, once we started our hike, we got about a mile and a half into our trip, and we had to turn around because my wife, understandably, was just not feeling up to it. So we headed back to the car, and that actually ended up postponing my first backpacking trip for quite some time because about 3 months later, our daughter was born, and in the chaos that is becoming a new parent, we completely put backpacking on the back burner. And it actually wasn't until a year and a half after our daughter was born that I finally was able to go on my first backpacking trip. Although there was one silver lining about all of this. I mentioned that my pack was incredibly heavy when I first put it on. So when I got back, I returned a whole bunch of really heavy equipment that I had. and I started to focus on buying some truly ultralight gear to lighten up my pack. So like I said, about a year and a half after our daughter was born, I was able to go on my first backpacking trip. And we actually went back down to the Smokies, and I decided to go back to the very same lakeshore trail. There's just something about my personality that if I leave something unfinished, it's gonna bug me for the rest of my life. So I wanted to head back down there and finish my trip. But this time I was going solo. My wife was gracious enough to stay and look after our kids so that I could go backpacking. And because I was going solo, I decided to go a bit further. So I went about 9 to 9.8 miles, something like that, to campsite 98. So I got to the trailhead, I put on my pack, which by the way, was a whole hell of a lot lighter than it was previously. And I started my hike by going through, once again, that really awesome tunnel. Now, if there was one theme about my first backpacking trip, it would be this: rain. It rained virtually all day and all night on that first day. And it was never a tremendous downpour. It was just a constant rain. I'll let you listen to it a little bit here. So other than the rain, that first day of hiking was relatively uneventful. Now that part of the Smokies is kind of in the very low section, so you're not really climbing 6 miles straight up a mountain, but it is hilly, so the cumulative elevation gain and loss is still decent, but again, not absolutely insane. However, my knees just do not do well in the mountains. They almost always start to hurt me at some point, especially on downhills, and that day was no different. My knees were starting to really hurt me about halfway through that hike, and by the time I got to my campsite, they were quite sore. But before I got to the campsite, I did have to go through a whole bunch of downed trees, including one that was, even to this day, still the biggest downed tree that I had to navigate around. I'll show you a picture of it here. You probably can't really see just how big it is from this picture, although there are some trekking poles there to kind of give you a little bit of context. But there was absolutely no way that I could climb over this thing, and it was very steep ridges on both the left and the right of it, so I couldn't really go around it. So I just had to crawl right underneath it, dragging my pack behind me in the mud. So that was fun. But despite those downed trees, I did eventually make it to my campsite, Campsite 98, and I gotta say, it's a pretty cool site. It sits pretty close to a pretty big creek, and it's also right on the edge of Fontana Lake. So you can kind of just get right up to it so you can see the rest of the lake. And there's two different campsite spots. One that is pretty much just for hikers, and then one where you can put stock, like horses and things like that. It is a stock campsite. So there are two different sections that you can essentially stay at. And then right in the middle between those two things is a very small little stream that kind of acts as your main water source because it's the closest one that's near where you'll be staying. Now fortunately, pretty much right when I got to camp, the rain stopped. So it gave me some time to set up my tent and also cook myself some dinner. So the tent that I was using on that trip is the Tarp Tent Pro Trail. It's something that I had gotten to lighten my pack. We originally bought a Kelty Salida 2-person tent, which was quite heavy. So instead I got this 1-person Tarp Tent Pro Trail, which lightened things up considerably. However, the first time that I set it up, I realized afterward that I was on quite a big incline and I would just be rolling off of my sleeping pad all night. So that really wasn't going to work. So I set it up a second time on the opposite side of the campsite, which was a whole lot flatter than the other one. And again, I had a little bit of a window to be able to cook some dinner before it started to rain again. Although my dinner was not very good because I brought one of those little instant mac and cheese bowls, and I didn't realize that I probably should have emptied those contents into a bag ahead of time because that little bowl that they come in just exploded from being crushed in my pack, and all the cheese sauce mix just went everywhere on the inside of my food bag. So shortly after dinner, the skies opened back up again and it started to rain. So I went in my tent about 6:30, and it just kept on raining ever since. Now, another thing that I realized, even though that tent spot was a whole lot flatter than the other side, I was still pitching it on an incline so that my head would be lower than my feet, and I find that to be extremely uncomfortable and not a very good sleeping position. So I actually ended up sleeping the opposite direction so that my head was much closer to the foot end of my tent. So that was fun. So like I said, it continued to rain, and it rained all night long. And there was another little lesson learned that I just didn't really realize since I was a brand new backpacker, and that is the fact that condensation is alive and well inside of tents, especially a single wall tent like the Pro Trail. So there was so much condensation on the inside, and again, I was sleeping with my face in the foot end of the Pro Trail, so it's much closer to the roof of the tent. And with the drops, the raindrops falling on the outside of the tent, it was of course just knocking off all that condensation. So I was getting sprayed in the face with water pretty much all night long. Again, that's not unusual or anything for backpacking. It's just something that, as a complete rookie, I didn't really realize would happen. Now, I figured that being my first night in the backcountry, especially by myself, I would probably not get a really great night's sleep. And I was right about that, but I was finally starting to doze off. The sound of the rain falling on the tent was actually quite peaceful, and I was finally starting to feel like I was going to fall asleep. And it was about 11:30, and I could feel my eyes starting to close, but then I saw a big old flash of light. Fun fact about myself, I am deathly afraid of lightning. Even today, it is my #1 hiking fear. I just absolutely cannot stand lightning, especially, again, on that very first backpacking trip of mine. I was absolutely terrified that I was going to get struck by lightning at any second, and therefore I just could not fall asleep, and I got the absolute worst night's sleep than I ever have gotten in the backcountry. Now, the rain did finally stop once morning broke, so I did have some time to sit around and just enjoy myself at camp and have a nice breakfast and pack everything up without rushing, but once I did, I was ready to get on out of there. So I started my hike, and my knees were still hurting me, but not nearly as bad as the day before. And again, it had stopped raining, so it was a really pleasant, beautiful hike. I really got to kind of take in all my surroundings and just, see how beautiful the Smokies really are. So I really enjoyed that first part of my second day's hike. So I eventually got to campsite 74, which you'll remember is where my wife and I had planned to camp that first time we tried to go backpacking, and it sits right along Forney Creek, which at that point in the Smokies is a big, huge, beautiful, rushing creek. So I decided that I wanted to sit there and just have a really nice, relaxing lunch, and again, take in all the scenery. But by the time I got there, I looked up at the clouds and they were as black as could be. So I knew it was going to start pouring any minute. So I just completely ditched lunch. I did not eat lunch at all. I filtered some water because I was completely out of water, and I started my hike back to the car, which was about 3.5 miles. But pretty much immediately after I left Forney Creek, it started to rain, except unlike yesterday, this time it was an absolute torrential downpour. I had never hiked in so much rain before my entire life. My God, did it rain a lot. It was quite a storm, and it was starting to lightning and thunder again. And that really got me going. So at that point, I was just done with this trip. I just wanted to get back to the car and feel safe again. So I really started to book it. I tried to hike as fast as I possibly could, which really made my knees hurt. They were absolutely killing me. The pain was so intense. So by the time I got back to the car, I had to pop a bunch of Advil because I was in some serious knee pain. But eventually I made it back to that tunnel, and it marked the end of my first backpacking trip, which, by the way, was truly a solo trip because I did not see a single person on that trail the entire 2 days. So on the drive back to my in-laws' house, I remember having this really kind of deep sense of dread and disappointment because, to be honest with you, in case you couldn't really tell by all my descriptions of my first trip, I didn't really have fun. I can't exactly say that I had a great time on my first backpacking trip. Now, when I look back on it now, I do feel a nice sense of reward and pride about my first trip, but at the time, I absolutely did not enjoy myself. And I was really kind of distraught about it because I thought, oh my God, did I really just spend all this time thinking about nothing but going backpacking and spending all this money on all this gear just to do something that I would probably just do once and never do again? But fortunately, I stuck with it and I just kept pushing myself to go on trip after trip after trip. And eventually, I really started to fall in love with backpacking. So that was certainly one of my lessons learned. And let's get to that point of the video now. So one of my lessons learned was definitely to just keep on trying. You might not really enjoy your first backpacking trip, but give it another go. Try it again. See what you think the second time, the third time, the fourth time. And if at that point you decide that, you know what, backpacking is really just not for me, that's fine. But you know what? You might fall in love with it just like I did. Another lesson learned was the fact that I probably should not have chosen that particular trip for my first time backpacking, especially because I'll totally admit that I had so much anxiety and fear swirling around in my head, from bears to rattlesnakes to lightning to getting lost to injuring myself, and not to mention the fact that I was completely alone. I just should not have done that. I really should have picked a location kind of in the general Chicagoland area, something closer to me where there are no bears or rattlesnakes, and also picking a day that is perfectly beautiful outside so I don't have to worry about lightning, and again, not to mention going with somebody else so I'm not by myself on my first trip. Ultimately, that would have helped me to enjoy that first trip more and also be more confident about going backpacking a second time. Another lesson learned has to do with gear. I mentioned that when I put my pack on for the first time during that first attempt, it was insanely heavy. So I learned to stop thinking in terms of pounds when it comes to gear and think in terms of ounces. This tent is only 7 pounds. That's not so bad. This water filter is only 1.5 pounds. That's also not bad either. But I didn't really have any kind of context about just how much a pound feels on your back. And of course, those pounds add up pretty quickly. So after that point, I decided again to return a lot of gear and focus on getting some truly ultralight stuff. And thinking again in terms of ounces instead of pounds really helped me to lighten up my gear. Another thing that I eventually learned, and I'm still always constantly learning this on the trail, is how to better manage my hiking fears. When I look back on that first trip, I really wish that I had eventually just said to myself, you know what, there is nothing I can do about the lightning. I'm here, I'm in a very low elevation, I'm not camping right next to a really tall tree, so I'm doing everything that I can do to be as safe as possible in this situation. So you know what, let's just relax and try to get some sleep, because again, there's nothing I can do about it. Now, of course, this is hard to do, it's easier said than done, but it has helped me on subsequent trips to be able to just tell myself that there's nothing I can do about this particular danger right now, so I might as well just chill out and try to enjoy myself. But perhaps my biggest lesson learned really had more to do with that first attempt when I tried to go backpacking, and that is the fact that you have to be patient when you're on the trail and to know that things just aren't always going to go according to plan, especially if you need to cancel one of your trips, which is always a really, really crappy, disappointing feeling. And actually, one more lesson learned from that first trip. When I look back on it, I really wish that I had remembered to have fun. You know, there were parts of the trip that I did have fun and I enjoyed it. And again, like I said, looking back on it now, I do feel like it was really rewarding for me. But again, at the time, I just did not have a whole lot of fun. And again, that has to do somewhat with hiking fears and anxieties, but also I was just so wrapped up in the trip itself and the plan and hiking and getting to the campsite, then getting back to the car and so on and so forth, that I just didn't really take the mental break to stop and enjoy being where I was and doing what I was doing. And I still to this day have to do that from time to time if I'm getting too wrapped up in trying to make good time, or trying to focus on what's next after we do some part in our hiking plan, that really I'm just out there to enjoy myself. I go backpacking for fun just like everybody else, but sometimes you forget to have fun and you have to remind yourself to do that. Well, thanks for watching. As always, stick around for some bloopers, and I would really love to hear from all of you about your first backpacking trip experience. Was it an astounding success, a total failure, or something in between? And what were the lessons that you learned along the way? Let us know in the comments. All right, thanks again, and remember, have fun out there. It would be an absolutely wonderful thing. I think the 40s sometime, maybe before World War... It couldn't be before World War II. I never claimed to be a historian. A really cool thingamabob. Going through, again, that very cool... What's that thing called? A tunnel! Down tree that I have ever come across. The dog has very loud nails. Those little, you know what I'm saying. What? And I. What the hell am I trying to say? I don't need to say that, do I? You don't really care. Suppose I could just show you the map right here. What else did I learn on that trip? Perhaps the biggest... Gonna burp again. Always gotta burp at least once.